So with that, can we get a big warm welcome for John Roberts?
Good afternoon, everybody. Is this the right volume or the wrong volume? Good, okay. So we're going to talk about one topic with 3 parts. And so I'm going to talk about each part individually, and then hopefully I'll bring it home by connecting them. So the first one is purpose. I feel that often we jump into our life and education without necessarily thinking about what is the purpose that we are pursuing by spending all this time and effort and money in seeking to achieve a degree or a financial reward or something to this extent. So I feel it's very important that we focus on defining this purpose, and I would like to lend some ideas on how we might do that, and I'll try and use maybe at times myself as a little bit of a case study, but not focus too much on that. So design thinking, right? IDEO, people are familiar. This is a crowd that I'm sure is very familiar with this. Research, synthesize, implement, and iterate, right? And so we think about this for products, but I think that we should be also thinking about this for our own lives. I think that we should be thinking about how do we research what is going to be our purpose, how do we synthesize that information and start implementing and iterating? Because I don't think that's static. I think it's not static. It's quite fluid how we kind of come to this purpose. It's not something that you somehow have one day and that's it. And if it is, you're kind of like that band that was the one-hit wonder and then it just dies, right? And so we're supposed to be at each point, I believe, iterating on our own purpose and our own existence. And so I'm going to back up and I'm going to talk a little bit about how I came to mine. I hope it's a useful case study. So in my former life, I was a chef, not like in some sort of transcendental way, like in actuality, I was a chef. And I started to become very confused by homelessness. I was living just down the street in Santa Monica. I was spending a lot of time walking around the streets and kind of became very confused about why these people were sitting there. And so I looked at this guy, and it might sound a bit insensitive, but I said, "How did you end up like this?" And he said, "Buy me some food and I'll tell you." So I bought him a McDonald's hamburger. And we sat down and we chatted. And I walked away from this feeling like my life had been fulfilled, or like I had found something. I couldn't quite put my hand on it yet, but I had found something. And that moment was going to be profound. I didn't know it how yet, but it was. So a couple days later, in looking for this same sort of fulfillment, I bought 20 burritos from La Salsa just on 3rd Street, and I handed them out to 20 homeless people. And I walked away from that like, yes, like better. And so then I'd say about a week later, I went out to a restaurant supply store. I bought a massive stock pot. I went to Home Depot. I bought a garden cart. And I went to Whole Foods, and I bought a huge sack of lentils. And I made organic, protein and vitamin-enriched lentil soup. I brought red party cups and started kind of walking down Venice Boardwalk and fed like 60 people. And I'm like, wow, like, okay, like that was solid. And that's about as much capacity as I have, with my current structure to do that. So I just started doing that. And so I did that for about 6 months, 3 or 4 nights a week, very informal. And in this process, really, of course, 6 months and 3 nights a week, it's a decent amount of time. I really found even more clearly, like, this is what I want to do. And I didn't quite know how to do that yet. I didn't know what that meant exactly, but this is what I want to do. And so I started to explore, like, life just kind of, because it was very informal for me at that point. This is my point. You have to keep iterating, right? It wasn't like I had some great understanding of what this meant. And so I went back to school. I started taking some classes. I started trying to figure out how could I apply this in a more macro context. Doing so pretty informally at first, but then kind of ever increasingly, and actually a lot of it because I was listening to my friends around me kind of saying, hey, we'd like to be a part of this sort of like effort that you're making. And so, what could you do to organize us to have this sort of same experience? And so I started organizing very short-term trips to Africa during our spring break. And during this, we came across kindergarten. That was a very grassroots organization, no funding, like 60 kids in like 15 by 15 foot room, no real school materials, just a chalkboard, and kind of walked away from that like, hey, you know what, maybe we could do something for this school, And so we went back to the States and we said, okay, how could we start actually having an impact on this school? And so again, I just want to bring us back to the whole thing here. It's about purpose, right? It's not about me, it's about purpose. So how do we develop our own purpose in life? And so that moment of now iterating, right? So I'm, researching, right? Actually getting my feet on the ground, trying to experience what does exist in this kind of new venue, poverty, that I found was like somehow part of my calling. How could we actually affect it? So I came back here, started asking people for money. People didn't want to give us money because people are hit up for money a lot, and we weren't a formal organization. So we incorporated, and this was an easy enough thing. It was low-hanging fruit. It was like, okay, you know, just incorporate an organization, apply for the 501c3, the nonprofit recognition, and then keep working and just see what happens, right? It was all very informal, especially in the beginning. And so you just kind of just moving your feet and iterating, right? Keep researching, keep synthesizing, keep iterating, keep implementing. And I started to get closer. And so the education thing just made a lot of sense to me at this point. This school thing made more sense to me than giving the La Salsa burritos or even giving the cup of lentil soup, is it felt like it had more substance, like it was going to actually achieve something greater, like it would affect the lives of these kids and then their communities. And so I started to really identify with education, and especially education in West Africa, which is statistically the least developed region in the world, that this was going to be my purpose. And so we funded that like little school. It was a couple $1,000s. That's all it took. Raise a couple $1,000s. What kind of crazy stuff have we spent a couple $1,000s on? We changed the lives of these 60 kids. And so then we kept going, so how do we go bigger? And so we ran some like summer programs where we had the idea of running a TOEFL course, so teaching English as a foreign language, running a course where these kids would be able to learn English. And if they did learn English, then we would help get them into American universities. We would help them apply. We would help them get funding and these sorts of things. We had 40 students that started, and we had one student who passed. He's currently a senior here in Southern California. He was like a 3.6 GPA, which is higher than I ever had. So you know, we had this feeling like, okay, like, you know, this was great, 40 students, you know, like that we were trying to affect, and we affected this one. And now it's cost us like $100,000 to send this one kid to school, right? It's really expensive to send a kid to school in the States. And again, what I'm hoping you're gathering from what I'm talking about is it was a system of trial and error, right? We were researching, synthesizing, implementing, and iterating. It was trial and error. It wasn't perfect in the beginning. But what we're getting to is pretty good, and so I'll hopefully keep working that way in the story. So then we started offering these courses a bit more at large. So we actually like advertised in the newspaper. We had hundreds of kids show up. We had teachers that we recruited from the States to come over and spend a year in West Africa. And we were really like progressing a form of learning that they didn't have good access to. And so we're like, okay, so we're getting somewhere. So I'm on a bus in West Africa, and I've been spending a lot of time thinking about like this university project that, you know, again, this like getting kids into university in the States, and we only had that one, and it's very expensive, and thinking about, you know, my meetings with UNICEF where they were talking about they only invest in primary education, and thinking about my meetings with like private high schools, and thinking about the missing part of the equation. There were almost no humanitarian organizations or grassroots leaders for that point actually creating institutions of higher education. It was like the missing part of the market. And so we're like, wait a minute, what if we did that? And like, so what are the kind of secondary effects, the positive externalities of actually building a university? So you have doctors who stop things like infant mortality. You have trained agriculturalists who prevent famines. You have entrepreneurs who create economy. You have people who understand politics and policy and actually how to run a country in a decent way. And so we kind of started to say, like, wait a minute, this would be really profound if we were able to do this. And so we went to the drawing board. How do we do this? We're a small organization. Our budget's like $150,000 a year. How does an organization with a budget of $150,000 a year start a university, right? This is endowments in the billions. How do you do this? Fast forward a year, and we're still in this road. We haven't forgotten. We're maybe I'm just going to toggle between these kind of a little bit here. We're driven. We understood what we wanted to do. We weren't sure how to do it, but we focused on trying to figure out how to do it. And so I went back to school. I did a master's in public policy. And in this kind of ecosystem and all the sorts of thinking and the way that they were helping me think and the things that I was being exposed to and the people around me and the classes I was taking, each one with like the succinct purpose of how do we build a university? It wasn't how am I going to get a degree to make money? It wasn't how am I going to become a doctor? Now, I'm not criticizing any of those ideas. What I'm saying, though, is if we go into education with this idea in my mind, what you want to accomplish, we get a lot more out of it. Every paper I wrote and the feedback I got on those papers, every conversation I had on the periphery of these classes, it all was like leading towards this linear goal. And so everyone knows like Malcolm Gladwell and the 10,000 hours, right? We've spent like 7,000 hours so far trying to figure out how to do this. And in the process, you keep meeting people along the way, and you have to be open to those conversations. And so I had a friend who was talking on Facebook, just posted like, hey, anyone who hasn't heard of this iTunes U thing, you should check it out. It's pretty amazing. You have free courses from Stanford and from Harvard, and they're putting them online for free. I'm like, really? So I actually went out and bought an iPhone for the first time for this. I had rejected the idea of spending that much money on a phone at first. And I went out and bought an iPhone to listen to these lectures. And so I'm on a bus on the way to do my master's, right? I'm taking a class. I'm on a bus, and I'm listening to this. I'm like, oh, my God, this is an amazing resource. This is an amazing resource. These lectures are sitting there for free. Like, do the kids that we know that need these higher education, do they know about them? Who's actually making sure that they actually have access to them? And that was like the second aha moment. Both of them on a bus, ironically. You know, and so I called my co-founder, Patrick, sitting right over there. I'm like, dude, I have an idea. And we started, you know, kind of ranting on this idea. And fast forward another year and a half, and we've launched. So we've launched the Open University of West Africa, which is an online university built from open educational resources, essentially. But again, the point is, we did it because we identified the purpose and we built towards that. And then we were driven to execute, and we got the education to do so. And in this process, we've actually been able to open the gateway to higher education in a region that had enrollment rates of like less than 10% if you just average the region. Some countries like 3%. And we're working now towards, again, just iterating that into the point where we would reach the actual masses. We're right now in like our alpha. And it's possible. If you just find that purpose that's going to drive you, you drive, and then you educate yourself along the way. And I think it works the other way around. You educate the driven purpose, right? And if you go both ways with this, you can accomplish a lot of things, and you can make sense out of what you're spending $100,000 on and what you're going into debt for and how you're going to do it. And that's my 2 cents. Thank you. Anybody have a question?
I've had a lot of these thoughts before, and what I keep coming back to is you have to have the people, you have to have the kids in the first place be thinking about purpose beyond career, beyond all the things that you're supposed to be looking for, things like that, to sort of like drive education in a way, to basically make students be potent consumers, educating consumers of education.
It really comes down to the families at this point. I think this is a cultural phenomenon. You know, we have to be willing to not just push our kids into university and say, you know, go and be a doctor. We have to be willing to say, what do you want to accomplish in life? And I want to help you find that.
But like schools are set up to, like, you're just tested on information. You're tested. You give back the same answers the teacher already knows and things like that. Like, the entire education system is basically set up on this premise that we can be factory workers. We can all be factory workers, basically. So what you're talking about is wonderful. I don't see any way. I don't know if you. Here's a question for you.
My biggest answer, and we're focusing on higher ed now, but I think if we wanted to focus on lower grades, it's a whole nother conversation, a whole nother area. But if we're focusing on higher ed, the biggest way to achieve this, in my opinion, is gap years. We should be like systematically pushing for gap years, where students will take a year off, figure out what they want to do before they ever invest any money into higher education. 25 grand or 30 grand, which is an average university price at this point, will buy you a whole lot of gap year, actually.
Are you working at this full time? Are you able to support yourself while you do this now? And at what point were you able to make the transition from a chef who gives away a week a year or a month a year to not a philanthropist who is trying to build a university in Southern?
No simple answer for that. I'm extremely blessed to have a family that has supported me to allow this to be possible, actually. And that's not everyone's case, I know. I think we all have to kind of try and figure out then within our means what is it that we're able to do. But I think always trying to take those risks and push. I mean, think of all the artists who who wait tables like 40 hours a week, live in pretty mediocre existence to then focus on their art, right? Same thing. We need to think about this achieving this purpose as our art, right? And life as our art. And if we all approach it that way, and not necessarily as like, what is my career? My career is going to be a doctor. Is my career is to achieve my purpose. And if we think about it in that way, I think we'd start making a whole lot of sacrifices that would enable us to do this in a more succinct way, regardless of whether or not we have that initial support. And then, of course, the key, and this is one more last little plug, the key is to then find sustainable and scalable ways of doing that. And this is now where like social enterprise, as opposed to just charity, for example, is I think the right sphere to look in. But that's my last 2 cents, I think, actually, because we're done with time. Thank you very much.